In your book, Endless Forms Most Beautiful, you say that Darwin's theory of natural selection is not the complete picture. You say that the modern conception of evolution is a richer, more complex affair than Darwin imagined. Darwin reasoned that the gradual changes in form were guided by natural selection. We just alluded to this just now. We now know that many of the most important evolutionary changes have involved modifications of the genetic switches that control where and when genes are used in development. So let's dive right into it. What are these genetic switches? What is evolutionary development? Or as the kids call it these days, Evo-Devo.
All right. I think, we get past the terminology or the big labels we put on things, because I think a lot of this is intuitive. So let's start here. You and I appear the way we do because of the process of development. Development is the process of an egg becoming an adult, and that's building all the tissues and all the inner and outer appearance of a three-dimensional thing. All right, and I'll talk about the animal kingdom. It'd be the same if I'm talking about plants, but it's easier to talk about animals because we are animals. So development is the making of an individual from an egg. Well, you can understand that if the physical characteristics of a species, of a population, is going to change over time, there have to be changes in development, right? So if you start thinking about a group of creatures, let's take something fun, like let's take the arthropods on the dinner menu. Let's take like crabs and shrimp and lobsters and stuff like that. And if you think about them, maybe the obvious differences between them are like the number of body appendages that are coming off the claws, the legs, the size of those things, and what's going on over evolutionary time in the making of different kinds of creatures is changes in development that change the number, the size, the coloration, the three-dimensional shape of body parts. Right. Okay. So those changes must be occurring during development. So Darwin had a good feel for this, that the study of development's generally called embryology. He thought that embryology was really important to evolution. But embryology was a complete black box, almost still completely impenetrable till I would say about 1980. Okay. We were simply just spectators. You could watch, say, take a frog embryo in a dish and watch it develop, but you're just a spectator at a pageant. It's an incredible process to watch. And all of us who've had kids or know a little bit about, human reproduction, it's just an amazing thing to think that a fertilized egg turns into a complete individual in 9 months. Yeah. And all that complexity, the organs, right? I mean, the brains, the eyes, all this sort of stuff. It's an amazing thing. And in other animals, it can happen in a short period of time, and it's an incredible pageant to watch. One of those things some of us never get bored looking at, right? Mm-hmm. So this process of development that we're just looking at, we had no way in. We didn't understand what was going on. How do you start with a single cell and build a complete complex creature? Well, right about 1980 is when things started to change. And the breakthroughs were in identifying the genes that were critical in bodybuilding, in specifying all the body parts, okay? So now connect the logic here. So if changes in form are due to changes in development, but we have no idea how development works for 120 years after Darwin, we got to solve development first. We got to at least crack development, maybe not solve it, but at least crack into it. So this field that you mentioned of Evo-Devo, what it says is that changes in development give us the changes in form that give us the great variety of life we see on Earth. So if you want to understand those changes in form, you got to understand the changes in development. And if you want to understand the changes in development, you got to understand development, okay? So without getting into any nitty-gritty yet, I just want everybody to get that logic, okay? Yeah. We all come from an egg, and that complex process, it's an amazing thing. Just unto itself is this own thing to be celebrated, a fertilized egg becoming an individual. But now you understand. Now think about the 500 million year plus history of the animal kingdom. You're like, all the things that have ever existed, from dinosaurs to butterflies, et cetera. How did all that stuff happen? And the key to understand that is to understand development and the building of bodies. If you want to know how to make different bodies, you got to understand how bodies are built. So the breakthroughs in development were the stepping stone to the breakthroughs in understanding the evolution of form. So what do you want to know about genetic switches?
What are they?
You brought it up in the question. So I'm just circling. I just want to make sure we understand the logic where we are.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me give you an alternative because it wasn't clear when I started in this business in the early 1980s. I'll give you two possible sort of ways that life could evolve, or at least form could evolve. You could imagine that take something like humans and fruit flies and dinosaurs and butterflies, and you might think they all have completely different sets of genes, right? I mean, looking at them from the outside, I mean, what would you expect? And that's pretty much, I think, the expectation that everyone had. In fact, I don't think I know anyone who could claim otherwise, that there would be, genes for making a butterfly and genes for making humans, right? So here's the breakthrough. Here's the mind blower. 1984, it was discovered that the genes involved in building a fruit fly existed in us. The first glimpse that was the case. Shocking. And some people didn't even almost, believe it at first. So we were so set up to think that a mammal, a human, and that we would have vastly more genes than anything on Earth because, of course, we're complex and intelligent and, super duper. So there's all this expectation that the genes between creatures would be totally different. And now we're finding, the genes that build the humble fruit fly are all lined up in similar place in a similar order, and you and I deal with it. And that discovery got repeated again and again and again. Genes that are critical for patterning things, like, for example, separating our fingers and making our 5 digits on hands and feet. Again, all this stuff shared with fruit flies. In fact, the genes were often first discovered in fruit flies, and then their counterparts were identified in us. Okay, so that's the first thing. I'm telling you now that what became known as the genetic toolkit is shared between vastly different animals. So essentially, the whole animal kingdom shares bodybuilding genes. Yeah. Exciting, mind-blowing. And that made the field of both developmental biology or embryology just absolutely thrilling for a long period of time. And it drew all sorts of talent, into studying these sorts of things. But I had my eye on the other question that immediately comes to that, which, okay, yeah, all right. So the genes are shared. How do you make different creatures? So that's the question that I really leaned into. And jump ahead, a lot of time and the work by a lot of people. The way you can make different creatures out of the same genes is to use those genes differently. That the time and place that you use them, the sequence in which they may be turned on and off, differs between different kinds of animals. And you can use a construction analogy. We're sitting here looking at Legos right here, right? You could take the same building blocks, right, and assemble them in a different order and a different spatial pattern, and you will get different outcomes, different constructs, right? So that's the crucial insight from Evo-Devo, was it's not so much the genes you have, it's how you use them. And at the deepest level in the DNA, what determines how those genes are used are things that I'll refer to as genetic switches. And it's a fair metaphor. Switch meaning whether the gene is on or off in a given cell. They're toggling on and off. So if you could peer into every cell in your body, there'd be thousands of genes that are on in a brain cell, but they're not on in your liver cell. Different sets of genes are in a liver cell. And maybe a different set of genes are going to be on in a skin cell with some overlapping sets. So that's telling you that even though the same DNA exists in every cell, different sets of genes are active and inactive in every cell. And that activity is governed by these switches. So these switches are key to development, and the evolution of these switches is key to the evolution of development and form.